Copyright. All characters in this publication are fictitious and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Copyright A. Copyright 2019 by Pete Townshend, Street, James Infirmary. Words and music by Irving Mills. A. Copyright 1929. Reproduced by permission of Emmy Mills Music Incorporated / Emmy Music Publishing Limited, London W1F9 Litres D. Cover illustration by Luis Toledo at Dutch Uncle. Cover copyright A. Copyright 2019 by Hachette Book Group, Incorporated. Hachette Book Group supports the right to free expression and the value of copyright. The purpose of copyright is to encourage writers and artists to produce the creative works that enrich our culture. The scanning, uploading, and distribution of this book without permission is a theft of the author's intellectual property. If you would like permission to use material from the book, other than for review purposes, please contact permissions@bugasa.com. Thank you for your support of the author's rights. Hachette Books. Hachette Book Group. 1290 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York 10104. HachetteBookGroup.com. Twitter.com/HachetteBooks. First edition, November 2019. Hachette Books is a division of Hachette Book Group, Incorporated. The Hachette Books name and logo are trademarks of Hachette Book Group, Incorporated. The publisher is not responsible for websites, or their content, that are not owned by the publisher. The Hachette Speakers Bureau provides a wide range of authors for speaking events. To find out more, go to www.hachettespeakersbureau.com or call 86637666591. Print book interior design by Huatext UK Limited, Edinburgh. ISBNs 978 0316 39898 5. Hardcover, 978 0316 39897 8. Ebook, E3 20,190,911 JVNFR. Contents. Cover. Title page. Copyright. Dedication. Book 1. Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Book 2. Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Chapter 13. Chapter 14. Chapter 15. Chapter 16. Chapter 17. Chapter 18. Chapter 19. Book 3. Chapter 20. Chapter 21. Chapter 22. Chapter 23. Chapter 24. Discover more. Author's Postscript for Rachel. Explore book giveaways, sneak peeks, deals, and more. Tap here to learn more. Book 1. Chapter 1. Light. Blinding white light. A man is standing with his back to us, arms outstretched. He is naked to the waist. His hair is golden, curling, shoulder length. We cannot see his face. As we slowly approach the man from behind, he begins to block the light. The sun is setting. His hair creates a halo. Suddenly the man leaps forward and we fly with him, sailing through the sky, over the blue-green landscape toward the sunset. It is with trepidation that I sit here in my eyrie this evening in June, a few days before my 67th birthday in 2012. I am Louis Doxtader, and this is my story. I am in the topmost room in a house already squatting high on a hill beside a busy road just outside the scruffy southern French hill town of Magagnesque. This house is rented and run by a rather lovely but eccentric psychic woman who invited me to stay with her here this summer. I pay all the bills, and she looks after me so that I can write. Only she knows why I am driven to relate this story. She knows my secret because she was a witness to it, and understands how important it is for me to demonstrate the way wonderful events have transpired as the result of something I once did that I greatly regret. I don't want to be forgiven. I want to sense some balance. I can't change the past, but neither can I allow a misunderstanding of the past to change the future. After you've heard my story, you will be able to make up your own mind. From this lofty position where I sit at my little desk, I can see the Mediterranean Sea and the distant Bay of Cannes, the port of La Napoule. Down in the valley is the nearby town of Grasse, famous for its perfume factories. Very few of the fragrances they produce reach me here, but the pine-scented air from the mountains that separate the valley from the pists drifts down sometimes. Dokstede, my surname, is probably Dutch in origin, but my great-grandfather was originally from Norway and I have lived in Britain all my life. My father, Edvard known as Ted, had been named after Edvard Munch, who painted The Scream, a dark, presaging idea when I was a child, and possibly one that helped shape me, as will become clear I hope. Munch was still alive when my father was born, and my grandparents had met the great man and been impressed. My father Edvard had moved to Britain between the wars, and remained there after the Second World War broke out. My mother always told me he had worked as a spy for the War Office during the war, Norway having capitulated to Germany. He was based near Northolt Airport, west of London, from where he went on a number of flight missions to Norway. He met and married my English Jewish mother, Claire, during the last years of the hostilities, and I was born just as Germany was forced to give up on Lebensraum. I first came to spend long periods of time with my godson, Walter, when he became friends with my daughter, Rain. They were at the same schools together from childhood, and had been born respectively in December and August of 1966. Walter is a musician. Even at the age of 8 he was always blowing and sucking on a harmonica, often with his head inside a plastic bucket in order to amplify the sound and shut out the world. I was close friends with Walter's parents and in awe of the orchestra in which his father performed. You might be interested to know how Walter Carroll Watts got his middle name. Walter's father, Harry, was a superbly gifted classically trained musician, but also a science fiction enthusiast. Karel Čapek was a Czech playwright who wrote R.U.R. Rossum's Universal Robots. It was Čapek's brother who came up with the word robot, which in Czech means drudge. Harry had great things planned for Walter, which is why he gave his son a middle name inspired by Karel Čapek's percipient play of 1921 about intelligent machines taking over the world. In his father's eyes Walter was destined for scientific greatness. Instead Walter chose playing the harmonica. In their late teens Rain became a journalist and Walter went to horticultural school. But Walter ended up concentrating on the music of the mouth and its associated instruments. Playing in pubs and clubs, he began to earn a good living even while he and Rain were still students. Walter became part of what has been called the fourth wave of rock, the one that happened in the 90s. Bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Smashing Pumpkins, but Walter's own music was a throwback to the post-punk years of the late 70s, the pub rock of Dr. Feelgood, the Stray Cats, the Fabulous Thunderbirds, and the Dave Edmunds Band. This was the simple, honest music Walter wished to revive and honor. Whatever wave he surfed in on, in my eyes Walter K. Watts was and always would be a 21st century 50s pop rocker. That is an adult statement. I am prone to them. I'm sad to say that as a middle-aged father in the early 80s I succumbed to drugs. I scrambled my brain, and but for a miracle would probably have died penniless. My wife, Pamela, left me, telling me she was taking herself off to a nunnery, and for many years I didn't know where she was. Incredibly perhaps, she left me with Rain to look after. That turned out to be a clever move, at least for me. The responsibility of looking after Rain, who was still at school with Walter, probably saved my life. I have gone on to do as well in my field as Walter has done in his. For today, while Walter is a famous rock star, I am now a well-known and respected art dealer in what is known as outsider art. It is also known by slightly snobbish New York gallery owners and of course by the French, who invented it as art brut. It is drawing, painting, sculpture, carving, and writing by artists who think differently. Indeed, they live differently. Sometimes their work is naive, sometimes it is obsessive, and sometimes it is extraordinarily fine or detailed. Behind such work there is usually a single idea, a single system. There is, sometimes, a revelation, a vision, or a mental explosion underlying the work, and they feel haunted or even possessed. They may hear voices, like a schizophrenic, and believe they are being directed. Some believe God is guiding them. The miracle of which I speak, The one that really saved my life was that perhaps because of what I had done to my brain I was able to see the value in the work of such mentally complicated artists. I became one of the first dealers in Europe to specialize in outsider art. I was certainly the first outside France and New York. Wealthy collectors and even some of the best international galleries acquire this stuff now. Indeed, it was through my work as a dealer that I came across Nikolai Andrei tilde copyright Vish. One day in the spring of 1996, 16 years ago, a woman telephoned me at my home in London. As I have no gallery, I work from home. I hope I am not bothering you, Mr. Dockstader, but I have been informed that you are the leading dealer in this country for outsider art. The woman's voice was rather husky, with what I would call a rather posh accent, tweaked by a soft northern lilt. That's correct, I replied. My name is Maud Jackson. I am the wife of Paul Jackson of the rock band Hero Ground Zero. Perhaps you remember them. Yes, I do, I answered. But I was racking my brain, trying to remember one of their songs. How can I help you? She explained that she had something to show me that might be of interest. Paul Jackson, I now recalled, had been a 60s rock star turned movie actor in the mid-70s who had been the founder of Hero Ground Zero. The band's name had been meant to echo the kind of anger and frustration of his young audience in the language Salinger had used in The Catcher in the Rye. A critic described Holden Caulfield as a Hero Ground Zero. What is it exactly you wish to show me? Are you an artist? At the time my roster of artists was full. Every one of my clients a difficult creature in one way or another. I was anxious not to overburden myself. Oh no, she responded quickly. I am not the artist in this instance. Can I come and see you? A few days later Maud Jackson came to my apartment cum gallery in Richmond in West London. As I opened the door to her I smiled involuntarily. Mrs. Jackson. I hesitated. Do come in. I was expecting someone. She cut in. Younger? Older? Not at all. Indeed, her age was immaterial at this precise moment. Assessing her quickly, as you do when someone new arrives at your door and you must invite them in and make them feel comfortable, I experienced a small but perceptible flutter in the region of my heart. Her face seemed familiar. Maud Jackson walked past me into my apartment with an elegance and dignity that as I watched her from behind made me feel lascivious. I quickly checked myself, but there was something intriguing about the way she moved. The tilt of her head as she turned and held out her hand to me made me feel I had met her before. The shade of her graying hair suggested that she had once been a natural blonde. Her skin was starting to loosen a little and to discolor slightly, and its tone was uneven, but her strong cheekbones pointed to a striking beauty, or at least a diverting prettiness, that she must have enjoyed when she was younger. She was not tall, but had a strong and upright posture that gave her presence. Her shoulders were square. She might have once been a competitive swimmer. Her eyes were a pale blue, her unsettling gaze hinting at a more vibrant past. She had a frank and direct way of looking at you. I estimated her age at between 45 and 50. It was hard to tell. I ushered Maud into my living room, decorated with the work of many of the artists I represent. I have kept a lot of the finest pieces for myself, and that has been the investment that makes me Walter's equal, financially speaking. Maud immediately walked across to an intriguing piece given to me by its creator, a calendar painting covered in dates and numbers. I love this, she exclaimed. Who is it by? Simeon Blake. He has an extraordinary memory for dates and historical events, and the progression in this painting revolves around my date of birth and leads both back and forward several thousand years. He uses a computer or something to establish that your birthday fell on a Wednesday in 1945. He makes that computation mentally, and all the progressions involved, in microseconds. In this painting he has selected only my birthdays on June 20th if they happen to fall on a Wednesday. Not only that, but he can attach significant events, happenings, and facts to every day he selects. Remarkable. Maud leaned closer to the painting as if in doing so she might unlock the mystery of Simeon's gift. I see that he hasn't attached any significant world events here on your birthday. My birthday fell close to the end of the Second World War. As did mine, she interjected. giving me the opportunity to say that she looked younger than her years. Thank heavens I avoided doing that, it would have been corny. She was the same age as me, then, 50. So broken I bumbled along, increasingly drawn to this attractive middle-aged woman. A few months, she said, before the news of the gas chambers was published. Yes, I replied. My mother Claire was Jewish. And so you? She asked. My father was not Jewish, and my mother's family were all killed in the war. Anyway, I live a secular life. I'm not sure about God. Are you? Once I would have agreed with you, but recent events have made me revise what I grew up believing, or rather not believing. I offered tea, which she accepted, and I went to the kitchen and poured boiling water over the leaves in the pretty blue china pot I only brought out for visitors. Her voice carried from the living room, and again my heart bumped. Did she sound like my long-lost wife? I couldn't place what was giving me that pain in my heart. I carried in the tea and set it down. So, I urged, please tell me what you have to show me. As she gathered herself I sensed she had something of a tale to tell. My husband grew old in his band. His bandmates were younger than he was and always wanted to do more touring than he felt comfortable with. In the early 70s there was no sign of the touring slowing down. My godson Walter is a musician, I said, interrupting her. He was a huge fan of your husband's band when he was a kid. I immediately felt I'd said the wrong thing, casting Maud Jackson's husband as a has-been from years gone by. I tried some redress, but of course Ground Zero continued to enjoy lots of hits, didn't they? She shook her head. Their last big hit was in the early 70s. But by 1975, despite the lack of hits they'd enjoyed at the start, audience demand for their live shows was still growing around the world. I saw less and less of my husband Paul as the years went on. At this moment Maud became real for me. She was a good-looking woman married to a hugely successful rock star who had probably spent much of her life overshadowed by him, and perhaps alone and lonely. I knew Jackson had acted in a movie. Walter had always been a big fan of Ground Zero before becoming an RB purist. Later, I did research and got the whole story. At 43 years old, worn down by commercial success with no creative expression, Jackson had broken up his band at the height of its success in 1979 in order to become an actor. The film The Curious Life of Nikolai copyright-ish was written and directed by John Boyd, an eminent British cinematographer, with Jackson in the role of copyright-ish, a charismatic musician who starts a religious cult. Paul found acting extremely tough, Maud continued. Rising before dawn and working until after midnight every day for several months was very different to the kind of intense but sporadic work he'd done in the band. Also, in the band he had been the boss. He'd had control of the schedule and the workload. He'd become a very heavy drinker, but he stopped in order to cope with what he knew would be a punishing filming schedule. To his credit, John Boyd never pretended the filming would be easy for my husband. But he was a famously hard-driving and meticulous director. Paul reached a kind of pinnacle of anxiety as the filming of the last scene approached. He knew that soon he was going to have to fend for himself again, freed from the discipline of filming that had helped him stay sober. Maud wondered if I had ever seen the film. I did see it, yes, I replied. Do you remember the final scene? I tried to summon up the iconic image. I remembered it had been absurd in a way, and rather overblown. Maud saved me the trouble. She rustled through the contents of her bag and produced a dog-eared page torn from the shooting script of the film. She handed it to me. Light. Blinding white light. A man is standing with his back to us, arms outstretched. He is naked to the waist. His hair is golden, curling, shoulder length. We cannot see his face. As we slowly approach the man from behind, he begins to block the light. The sun is setting. His hair creates a halo. Suddenly the man leaps forward and we fly with him, sailing through the sky, over the blue-green landscape toward the sunset. So this is the last scene in the film? I was confused. It seems like a grand beginning. An opening scene to an adventure. Maud laughed. It should have been. It was the beginning of a new phase for my husband. and for me too. But it was the end of the film. My husband had been standing on the summit of Skiddaw in the Lake District. She sounded to be on the edge of tears. He looked down at the glory of Derwentwater and the blue-green hills. It is the most extraordinary spot. The cameras were rolling, and an enormous Klieg lamp behind him was singeing his hair. He was exhausted from 2 months of solid work. All these extraordinary images and events have since been handed down like folklore among the local people. She described the scene beautifully. I realized that at the time, her husband still lost to her. She had probably been trying to make something poetic out of her loss, as well as open up. So what happened then? I asked. My husband lost his marbles. Maud went on to explain that the scene in question was to run under the credits to the film. This was itself unusual, as films are rarely shot in chronological order. It was, as they say, a wrap. Shooting over, the crew congratulated each other. One of the crew said that after flying down the mountain in the hang glider, right over the second unit waiting down near the lake in order to shoot him flying low overhead, he was supposed to land and return to the unit in the second unit jeep. The helicopter chasing him could not follow as the light was fading. He disappeared into the gloom. Where did he land? I asked. I was becoming increasingly curious to know more. What did the film crew say? None of them seemed to know, Maud said. They said he would probably have found an updraft and would be flying low, although by this time it was more or less pitch dark. They said he was an expert by then. He had been practicing, of course, but a broken bar. Naturally there was a boozy celebration gathering held that evening by the film crew in the nearby White Horse Inn at the foot of the hills. Maud quickly looked away. I had arranged to meet him there, but he didn't show up. I quickly realized something was wrong and set off alone to find him. At that she fell silent, gazing out at the sky for a few moments. Do you believe in coincidences, Mr. Dockstader? Maud asked as she turned to look at me, searching my face for any sign that I might be an unbeliever. I don't think they are significant in the way some people do. Neither do I, she agreed. She looked down into her lap. It did seem to me that Paul's disappearance must have been planned in advance. I suspect the film producers recognized it would make a story that would greatly help the film. I felt no one was taking Paul's disappearance very seriously and thought they probably knew very well where he was, but he might have been killed. I was shocked at the idea that Jackson had been subjected to some kind of stunt. Surely they would have let you in on this? Exactly, agreed Maud. But one of the crew mentioned that the movie's insurance was still valid. They seemed rather callous. Paul was their star, I said. They would have needed him for all the publicity surrounding the release, surely? I'm afraid I thought the worst of them all, but I also had a bad feeling about Paul. That he had crashed? Yes, but not in his hang glider. I feared he had crashed emotionally at some point during the filming. He could be a very difficult man. As I say, he was used to being the leader, and making all the decisions in his life and career. He was also used to drinking hard whenever he felt under pressure. It had always been an effective medicine for him. What are you saying? That he had screwed up the filming in some way? Not exactly, she said. My fear was that he had lost the affection of the team around him. Maybe he had started to drink again and they had become tired of him, and were probably all glad to get rid of him. They surely knew they were getting a tricky old rock star when they hired him. What do you know about the behavior of the artist who drinks too much? Do you have any alcoholics on your own roster? Very few of my clients drink. They are intoxicated enough. Maud smiled at this. I wanted to talk about myself, to engage her in my story, to draw her into my life and feelings. I drank and used drugs myself, I confessed. I know what happens. Maud did not seem surprised. She smiled once more. I climbed Skiddaw myself to search for my husband. How much she had loved her man, however foolish he was. I was envious of him. I don't want to make you do another interview. I smiled, hoping to reassure her, but what happened next? Well, I took a room in the White Horse Inn. But I hardly slept. So in the early hours of the next day, as soon as there was enough light, I got up and dressed and visited the local policeman who lived in a nearby cottage. To my great relief, he arranged a search party. In contrast to the indifference of the film people, The locals treated it all very seriously. Apparently any soul lost on the fells gets the same response. After 2 days of searching, the team was getting increasingly worried. Paul was found. Where? How was he? What an extraordinary story she told. She put up both her hands and seemed to wave them in midair, as though impatient with me. "I'm sorry, this is always hard to tell," she went on. He had managed to fly about 15 miles, as the wind was strong, and the hills indeed created lots of updrafts that kept him soaring. When he finally landed, he was alone in the dark. The search party who eventually discovered him were shocked at his condition. "Were you the?" I cut in. "With the team who found him?" "I was nearby," she explained. "I was there shortly after they found him." He was still stripped to the waist as he had been in the film. He was shivering, and at first appeared to be delusional. He'd been sheltering in a shallow cave halfway up one of the mountains. He was a pathetic sight, Maud went on sadly. Her eyes were now moist, but then she cheered up and began to smile. He was also quite impressive. She grinned. He looked like a castaway on an island who is rescued after years of living on coconuts. She paused for what seemed like an embarrassingly long time. "At first, I didn't stir, but our meeting was taking up a lot of my day. Would you like some more tea?" I offered. Maud shook her head. She used her right hand to make sideways circles, like someone describing a movie in charades. "This is the amazing part," she said. "He told me he had experienced a divine revelation triggered by the heat and light from the film lights, and the sheer magnificence of the vista across Derwentwater. He had seen what he described as the A harvest." My attention was sparked anew. Maud went on with her story. He was extremely specific and very coherent about what he had seen, but he would not be talked down from the mountain. What did he mean by the A harvest? All very strange, but I knew my husband. He had definitely seen what he described. He saw 100 angels, all in the shadow of one massive angel with wings that stretched from one side of the valley to the other, all flying low over a seething mass of several thousand human souls waiting for guidance and transport to wherever they were destined. "Destined?" I interjected. "Where?" I assumed he meant to some other place, heaven, hell, the astral plane. I don't really know. I had endured my own awful visions as a result of drug withdrawal, but I had never myself experienced anything quite like what Paul Jackson had felt and seen. Maud took out a small handkerchief and dabbed her eyes. I asked him where this flood of human souls were supposed to go, but he said he didn't know. When I allowed some skepticism to show, he said angrily that he had seen what he had seen, and he could never be the same again. But I believed him. She turned to me, almost in an appeal. Maud had stayed in her small room above the noisy bar of the White Horse for several months, sometimes spending a morning climbing to her husband's little cave. It was really more like a cutting in a hillside protected by a tree. On these occasions she took him various items he told her he needed: maps, a tent, a small shovel, a compass, a knife, pencil and paper, a waterproof jacket, a drinking water bottle, a huge supply of small plastic lighters of the kind used by smokers, blankets, and a walker's backpack. He planned to kill small animals to eat, but she also took him food. I sometimes tried to give him money, she explained, but he would never accept it. Perhaps remembering the pain she had felt back then, the impotence and frustration, her face hardened and she suddenly looked older, her lips tight and lined like a smoker's. I thought he might have begged for money from fell walkers he came across on his walks. At this memory, she smiled again. "Why did you think that?" "He sometimes had things in his cave that I knew had not come from me," she explained. "And in the second week of the second month I gave him a complete collection of Wainwright's guides to the Lakeland Fells, and that he did accept. Do you know about Wainwright?" I nodded my assent. It is often said that it would take a lifetime to cover all the ground that Wainwright himself had explored in order to produce his famous guides to the entire Lake District. It seemed Maud's husband had dedicated what remained of the rest of his own life to the task. "From the time I gave him the guidebooks," she declared, "he became much harder to track down." Maud explained that her eccentric husband lived like a tramp-cum-hermit very successfully for a number of years on the hillside near Keswick, I'd almost given up hope of ever being able to have a normal life with him again. As Maud spoke of all this, her eyes filled with real tears, and I took the opportunity to move to console her, putting my hand on her arm. She dismissed my action, not kindly, with a series of impatient nods, dried her eyes, and continued. Of course I called him Paul, his given name, the name of the man I'd married, but he told me firmly that he was now Nikolai and copyright-ish. He was living out the character he had brought to life in the film. I must, he said, call him Nick. He insisted that one day the world would understand that the revelation he had experienced had come about as a direct result of his work on the film. He said he had become a new man in those last moments of filming. Does he still call himself Nick? She nodded. And I have accepted it. I call him that too. How did you manage? Did you have anyone to help you? I tried to imagine how she must have felt alone up in Cumbria, trying to keep communication with her husband open, desperately concerned for him. 3 months after the final scene of the film was shot, she said, the completed feature was released with the usual publicity fanfares. It was then I realized that even if it had not been planned by the producers, my husband's wild adventure, his absence, and the story of his mental condition were going to make useful and controversial publicity material. Boyd's film had been a success. The riddle around the leading actor's disappearance in the mountains of the Lake District, his visions, and finally his adoption of the elaborated name of the character he had played in the film, all added to the mystique of the project. The PR company spun the story to great effect, but after a successful release the wheel eventually wobbled and stopped, and Paul Jackson was forgotten. Eventually Maud returned to London and visited her husband less frequently. Sometimes she would drive all the way to Cumbria only to spend several days wandering the fells herself, never coming across him. Finally, she simply sent packages for him to a policeman she had come to trust, and he would march up to Nick's cave on his day off and leave them under a pile of rocks. Old Nick, said Maud. Like the name of the devil. She was laughing again. Her husband Paul had rechristened himself Nikolai, and the locals and the fell walkers shortened it to the new nickname. He was rarely sighted in the area, but he was seen often enough for Maud to know he was still alive, still holding up his arms to the rising sun at dawn, and again as it set in the evening. I wondered, said Maud, if he was still seeing the hosts of angels he had spoken about. Were they still ushering legions of lost souls? Was he seeing souls passing on to the next life? The next life? I couldn't hide the incredulity from my voice. Whatever each one of us believes, when we speak of such things in the modern world it is unwise to betray too much metaphysical faith. I found Maud attractive and intriguing, but she seemed oblivious to my interest in her, and I'm afraid my patience was really starting to grow thin. Our meeting was overrunning the time I had allowed for it. Interesting. But how? I asked. I feared quite rudely when I looked back later. How does any of this concern me? Maud explained that having lived rough for 15 years, a few weeks prior to calling me, her husband had walked into the public bar of the White Horse Inn in the Derwentwater Valley. He announced that he had come down from the mountain for good. The first thing Maud knew about her husband's return to the normal world had been a message that he was in a police cell in Keswick. The local people had become fond of Maud, and by reputation and gossip of old Nick as well. The story was that one afternoon Nick appeared in the doorway of the inn. His hair was long and curling, a fire with the light behind him. The Lake District in Keswick had been enjoying the quiet part of its season. Spring was slow to set in and it should have been cold and rainy. That afternoon was an exception. The bar was populated by a few locals, a number of professional-looking walkers with the usual thick socks tucked into their boots, and a group of rather trendy-looking teenagers surrounding a gaudy, noisy, electronic gambling machine. My husband was lucky. Maud glanced around my living room, her eyes flitting along the carefully hung paintings. She shook her head sadly and turned back to me, looking me in the eye again. From the point of view of the people in the bar he must have appeared to be a strange old man. But one of a group of young farmers standing around the buzzing and burbling machine had recognized him from his days as a rock star, and as Nick roared that he was thirsty, they bought him a pint of really strong local beer and he drank it down in a single throw. By the time the local policeman arrived to calm him down, he was preaching hell and damnation. Maud laughed. He hadn't had a drink for years, and was accusing the young farmers of trying to poison him. He was shouting that he would fly away back from whence he had come. I summoned the memory of insanities of my own for a moment. No doubt, in the ramblings of the freshly repickled alcoholic, old Nick saw stars, frogs, goblins, and probably fire-breathing devils with pitchforks. Maud travelled north to rescue her old man the same evening, and after a brief appearance in court for disturbing the peace he was released. Then, following a brief roundup of his possessions, spread all over a dozen hiding places in the Lake District, she brought him home to their house in Chiswick. The one item she left behind was his hang glider. Despite his latest vision, it seemed that at last he had remembered who he really was, and had been all along. I still wanted to call him Paul, of course, Maud recalled. But even our close friends started to call him Old Nick, despite his youthful-seeming sun-tanned body and his lovely, long curly hair, which was still almost golden. Maud caught my eye as she said this. I must have looked skeptical again, for she looked down at the floor shyly and seemed slightly ashamed. I've had visions, I said suddenly, wanting to bring her back to the present. I think I understand what Nick saw, or thought he saw. My visions were induced by drugs, but I saw extraordinary things. I wanted to tell her about screaming faces I had seen in an old bedhead, while I was still married to Pamela. It was a long story. I took a breath to begin, but as if by this confession of sympathy I had qualified myself to be worthy of the moment, Maud unrolled the waterproof tent ground sheet she had brought with her, and I gazed at the first of her husband's magnificent drawings. I was astounded. I greedily flipped through the sheet. There were at least 20, and Maud said there were dozens more. Each one portrayed with breathtaking precision a single freeze frame of old Nick's vision of the angelic final harvest. This work is extraordinary, I spluttered. It's stunning stuff. Imagine if he could really see what he's depicted here, what that means. She told me that old Nick had spent a number of his years while living rough making the drawings, that they were rolled up and stored in the cave where he had often sheltered. They were a complete surprise to me, she continued. Paul had always been a competent artist, art school like so many of his rock star peers, but he'd never drawn more than a few simple portraits for family birthday cards in the past. I was gratified that none of the sheets was signed, because I knew immediately and instinctively that Nikolai Tilda copyright-ish was a better moniker for an outsider artist than Paul Jackson. Nikolai Tilda copyright-ish, I mused silently. Born while filming the story of his own rise and fall. Everyone in the world of outsider art should be gratified he had gone mad in the process. It is a cliché copyright to say it, and I am ashamed that such a bold notion passed through my mind as I surveyed the exquisite pencil and charcoal drawings before me. But I heard myself whisper, "Maud," I said, my voice barely audible and quavering a little with excitement. "You and I are probably going to make a lot of money." For the first time since she'd arrived in my apartment, Maud looked happy, with a happiness I felt I knew. Again, my heart fluttered. Chapter 2. By the time Maud came to visit me in 1996, Walter was already established in a successful career. His eponymous pub rock band was known as Big Walter, and his stand, later known simply as The Stand, he called himself Big Walter in homage to Little Walter, his harmonica-playing RB hero from Memphis, Tennessee. Walter's band's name, The Stand, was in fact a reference to a way of standing. At certain points in his performance he would position himself like a statue, his harmonica in his right hand ready to play, held in what appeared to be an attempt to keep light from his eyes. His left hand was stretched out as though he were balancing on an imaginary surfboard, his knees slightly bent and turned a little to the right, his body twisted slightly at the waist. When he took this pose, the audience knew they could soon expect a powerfully explosive harmonica solo, and the girls began to scream and the boys to shout. After one such exciting night in 1995, Walter showed up at my flat. As I opened the door to him, I was reminded of how good-looking he was, with his high cheekbones, but also that by some measures of good looks he was flawed. His eyes were rather small and a somewhat indistinct color, and for a man just 28 years old he looked weather-beaten, like someone who had worked for years on the deck of a fishing boat, or thrown ropes from a horse to lasso cattle. His hair was black and thick, worn long. Now he looked anxious, but didn't speak immediately. It was late, and I was ready for bed, but he knew I took my role as his godfather seriously and my door was always open to him. I had always been his mentor. I had long wondered if Walter thought I understood him in ways his parents didn't. Harry and Sally had been confused when he completed his horticulture degree and picked up his harmonica again. Had they expected he would become a sort of gentleman landscape gardener? "Uncle Louis," he said. He'd always called me Uncle Louis. "I need some help." "Okay," I replied, worrying he turned to drugs or gotten into trouble with one of his fans. "What's up?" "It's hard to talk about this. I'm not going mad, but I know when I start to speak about what's happening to me you might think a broken bar." Walter seemed to lose momentum. "Walter," I said gently, "of course you're not going mad. What is happening to you?" "I've been hearing shit," he said. "Usually after gigs I can't sleep." "Hearing shit?" I teased. That's intriguing, Uncle Louis." He sounded rattled. "I'm frightened." "Tell me what happens," I said, serious now. "Our shows have been amazing recently, intense. I've been singing well, but my harp solos have been getting better and better." "That's good." "Yeah, it's cool, and the audiences have been going completely nuts." "That is cool," I agreed. "So what's the problem?" "I can't work out quite what's going on, or why it's happening, but I think I am making some kind of deep connection with the people down the front." Frankly, I had no idea what Walter was going on about and was trying not to look blank. He continued earnestly, "I know you deal with artists who have mental trouble, but they kind of fold it into their creative work." "Walter, just tell me what's going on." "You know, I've spoken to you about this in the past. Some of our fans are there every single night, often right in the same position." "That irritates you?" "I think I remember you saying as much." "I fucking hate it, but I hate it that I hate it. They are fans. They pay the rent after all. But I feel I don't have to win them over. They're in the bag already. They don't offer a challenge. They know what I'm going to do next, what I will say between songs. I find myself some nights actually following their emotional lead rather than driving my own journey." "I see, but you said you were hearing stuff," I said. "What is it you're hearing?" "Is this to do with these loyal fans?" "When the music finishes, when the applause dies down, there is music in my head that carries on and sometimes it feels very dark." "Your ears are ringing?" Walter laughed. He had a rhythmic laugh that rattled like a machine gun. For a moment the concern left his face, and he looked young again. "Yes, of course they are. But this is different. This is music, sound. And it's more than something in my ear. It's in my head and I can feel it as well. It's like I'm having attacks. Sound attacks. It sounds crazy." I knew it would sound crazy. I tried to reassure him. He was getting terribly upset. "It doesn't sound crazy, and it's obviously very serious. To you at least." He didn't reply. "Walter," I reached out to him gently. I had not seen my godson looking so vulnerable since he'd been a small boy. He sat with his hands in his lap, like a boy outside the headmaster's study awaiting a punishment of some kind. He looked up into the air, at the ceiling, then to his left and right. "I can hear it now, Uncle Louis," he said, his voice almost breaking into a sob. "It feels like a kind of mental attack. I feel like calling this a sound attack. When I talk about it, or think about it, it comes back. I hear it again and I think it comes from the fans at the front." "Who else have you spoken to about this?" Walter was married to a beautiful Irish girl a year or two older than he was, called Siobhan Collins. "What about Siobhan?" "I've spoken to her about it." "What does she say?" "She isn't wild about anything to do with the band, to be honest. All those pretty girls down the front. Anything to do with my band work is hard for her. She thinks I need to do more serious work, to take myself more seriously." "You mean she wants you to leave the band?" If I sounded surprised then, I also wondered where Siobhan was coming from, although I thought I probably shared some of her worries. Walter's manager, Frank Lovelace, was particularly hard driving. With a large stable of artists, he always had an eye on the big deal, keen to make commission. Walter was pivotal to the band's success, and Frank Lovelace had an overly controlling personality where Walter was concerned. I don't know, she's never said as much, but she's Irish. He laughed again, that musical laughter bringing him back to life for a moment. She wants me to be the new Seamus Heaney or something. He shook his head. Siobhan worked for the BBC in the Central Newsroom in London. She was in charge of a group of foreign correspondents. One of her team was my daughter Rain. Have you spoken to Rain? It was a silly question. Rain had been away in Afghanistan for a few months. Not about all this. Listen, Uncle Louis. This has never happened to me before. I feel I'm jacking into thoughts that are coming from the crowd. But it's what you're good at, Walter. I was right. Walter often seemed to hold the audience in the palm of his hand. No, this feels very negative. Like I'm hearing their fears, magnifying them. Tuning into your audience, anticipating them, is what you do, especially well. It's what all good artists do. Surely Siobhan is proud of you? She is. But it's not just the band she feels is beneath me. She thinks clubs like Dingwall's pretend to be better than they are. They pretend to be like an Irish pub with fiddles and pipes and Murphy's fresh from the brewery. Walter laughed. I've been with her to a few of those back in Waterford. They're pretty wild. I have no doubt they're full of pretty girls too, I added. For just a moment Walter seemed more like his old self. He had always been self-assured and determined, but I could see something had changed in him. We talked for another half an hour. I thought that listening, just listening, was probably better than trying to come up with ideas or grappling for a solution. He had always told me that whenever he played music he had to listen. In fact, he claimed that good musicians were divided between those who listened and those who simply played. Great musicians did both, played and listened. Walter aspired to that greatness. And lately when he listened he had begun to hear these strange sounds that were both unexpected and unwelcome. So he was becoming afraid of this listening. He was terrified he would be unable to continue as a musician working with others. A police car siren jolted me from my thoughts. I realized I hadn't asked Walter a very obvious question. So haven't you spoken to Harry? Walter's father, my old friend. Harry had been a good father, if rather a distant one. He was, as I say, a successful musician, toured a lot, and seemed to live in an elevated world. Classical organ Messiaen and Bach. Harry's wife, Walter's mother Sally, was also a confidant of mine, telling me about some of their difficulties as a couple. I don't want to worry my dad, said Walter quietly. Not yet at least. So you will speak to him? When there was something he didn't want to explain, or reveal, Walter simply said nothing. Now and then he would send a signal that he was considering whether to speak out or not. He would rub the side of his nose while wearing a slightly mischievous expression. Sometimes this would lead to him saying something. Sometimes it would just preface silence. On this occasion he did speak at last, but I got the feeling he was not saying what he had intended to express. I think I should probably see a doctor first. Walter explained that he knew that if he talked to his father, his first response would be to ask if he had seen a doctor. Write down your experiences, I suggested. It will help if you do see a doctor. What? Describe it, or score it. Walter's technical abilities as a musician were not equal to his father's. He couldn't read or write music. You know I deal in outsider art, Walter. I laughed. If you write it down, if you could enable others to get a sense of what you are hearing, you could join the fabulous artists on my roster. As a poet, I laughed again, forcefully, trying to bring Walter into the present, to lighten what he was feeling. He sat back and looked away. I can describe what I hear, he said, looking up at me with a sad look. But I would find it very hard to turn it into music that people could hear. I'd known Walter since he was a child. But I knew the way he was perceived by others, by his bandmates, by his fans, by the band's manager. They saw him as someone who was merely handsome, rugged, and cool. He looked like a man who could do pretty well in a fight, but I don't think many people had any idea of his inner depths. I'd seen signs of it even when he was a child. He had studied gardening and his dream was to create a maze one day. he said. He told Rain that it might take 25 years for a maze to grow thick enough to get lost in, even longer in some cases. Every maze could become a real labyrinth, given enough time and care. He struck me as a young man who, unlike most of his friends who wanted their desires fulfilled as quickly as possible, understood the joy of waiting for nature to take its course. Was there anything else? I inquired. Walter was holding something back. Either I'd said the wrong thing or I'd touched a nerve. Walter shook his head and picked up his coat and bag. A shaft of light caught his face and I found myself musing that this new vulnerability would make him even more irresistible to the women he allowed close to him. My daughter Rain had always loved him. The childhood crush had become an unspoken passion. Siobhan had sensed she might be a rival, and as her boss at the BBC always seemed to be packing Rain off to faraway trouble hotspots. Walter hugged me and smiled his goodbye. In the winter of that year, 1995, my daughter Rain came to see me at my apartment. I thought for afternoon tea and, using the door key I had given her, let herself in, crashed her journalist's.A copyright case to the floor, slammed the front door, and threw her coat to the ground in the lobby. She strode into my living room, slumped onto the sofa, and with a disgusted look, and without any preamble, announced that Walter was married. I arrived back in London, went to the office, saw the ring on Siobhan's finger, and asked her friend who was the unlucky man. She told me, Siobhan married her boyfriend, your friend Walter. Rain had been away in Afghanistan with a BBC unit travelling with a US-supported Mujahideen patrol on and off for 2 years, documenting the anticipated end of hostilities in the region. Of course I, on the other hand, knew Walter was married and had been at the wedding on June 25, 1994. Why didn't you let me know, Dad? Rain had tears in her eyes. I should have been there. At Walter's wedding. He was like my brother. I knew that what she really meant was that Walter was her passion. She should have been his wife. She must have known it would not have been feasible for me to contact her while she was on patrol with the Mujahideen. I had been completely smashed at the wedding. I remember almost nothing. I had woken up the next day feeling like death and quickly tried to forget all about it. As Rain sat, miserable, she had good reason to be upset. I stopped what I had been doing, poring over some accounts. I regarded my offspring intently as if for the first time. She was quite beautiful at that distraught moment. Her hair cut short was strawberry blonde. Her skin was slightly freckled, pale, and always sensitive to the sun. She had very little of my mother Claire's beautiful Jewish coloring, but she had inherited her maternal grandmother's strong bone structure. Rain was not the image of her mother, neither was she the image of me. Lucky for her, as I am no oil painting. Rain's mother, my long-lost wife Pamela, had been pretty enough, and extremely ginger. I don't use that word pejoratively, I can assure you. I was a sucker for the look. It would be absurd to call her a redhead. Pamela was ginger, and delightfully so when she was young. Her appearance matched her personality. She was excitable, unpredictable, and capricious, spicy. So it was a shock to me that, when Rain was born, Pamela suddenly decided to become celibate. Oh, and also to become a Catholic. Up until that time she had been, to put it as politely as I can, almost a nymphomaniac. She had been legendarily ginger, hot. As a young husband prior to Rain's birth, I sometimes felt as if I had landed in paradise. No man could have wanted more from his wife, sexually speaking. I need you to know that women found me attractive. Some women still do. I'm a strange-looking man in some ways, a mix of racial stereotypes, the Aryan with the Jew. But it's worked well for me. I am middle height, with brown eyes, jet black hair that I usually wear long, and although I'm getting thin on top, I have enough up there to pass for a man a little younger than my years. Not bad, for I've never looked after my body or my face. The one thing I find that occasionally causes some women to shrink away from me is my beard. It isn't long, and I don't always sport it, but I prefer wearing a beard. I feel my chin is a little weak. When I look in the mirror I don't often shout, "You handsome devil, go get Emma's eye splash on the cologne," but it has happened a few times. My face has the appearance of being wider at my forehead than it should be, but that's because my chin is small. I've painted a strange picture of myself, but Pamela often used to call me cute or gorgeous. When we made love and our faces were close together in the half-light, I would call her beautiful because that was how she looked then. She would call me handsome. I assumed she was telling the truth. But we were never a family who exalted the notion of high self-esteem, and Rain didn't think of herself as the beautiful woman she had become. Men fell for her, but Walter always treated her like a sister. Suddenly, as Rain sat clearly seething, and the air buzzing with her beauty, the room sizzling with her abruptly evident but frustrated sexual energy, I saw her mother in her. "Come on, Rain," I said. "My godson has married a fan." That's what she was. I tried to laugh, but I was winging it. This caused an even wilder display of irritation from her. "Siobhan is super smart, Dad. If she was a fan, she was also being secretive with me. They must have decided to get married on a whim. How could you have been at the wedding and not let me know?" She exploded, jumping to her feet, banging her palms onto her thighs so hard they probably bruised. I didn't want to face the fact that I really didn't remember very much at all about the wedding. I had a dim recollection of giving some drugs to Siobhan's younger sister, Selena, who was there with her pretty friend Floss. "Siobhan is actually older than me, Dad. Walter has married my fucking boss." She had started to pace the floor, then stopped and, whirling around, slapped her hand on her forehead. "Jesus. I reckon Siobhan packed me off to Afghanistan for 2 years while she did the dirty deed." Then Rain slumped again, and there were real tears. Of course I did have influence in Walter's life and career. Rain knew this very well. I was Walter's chief mentor, his guiding light. Perhaps partly because he had seen me at my worst, and seen me recover, he listened to me. I could have helped him to see that my daughter was in love with him if only I myself had noticed. But I hadn't spotted Walter and Rain as potential lovers. I had missed a beat. To me they would always be a couple of kids playing in the garden in a paddling pool, or digging in the sand on the beach at Clacton. Being a single father is difficult for many obvious reasons, but I made it all even harder for myself by being an addict. The drugs didn't stop me functioning. They numbed some pain, but also my senses. I hadn't been entirely alert to what was happening between these two lovely kids right under my nose. They loved each other, but Rain had gone further and fallen in love romantically. Rain would have been about 10 or 11 when Pamela and I were attempting to hold our marriage together. I was using heroin as a way to survive my unrequited sex drive for the ginger fuckfest wife I had once enjoyed. One day in a very strange period in which I was trying to get off the smack, we decided, the ginger fuckfest wife and I, that we needed a larger, wider bed. "You want to sleep farther away from me?" I mumbled pathetically, adding something I didn't mean. "But I want to sleep farther away from you too." "Ha!" exclaimed Pamela. "You think this is a game?" "No," I corrected her. "I do think a bigger bed would be a good idea for us. We've been married for a long time now. I know women get bored with their husbands, maybe even find them irritating." "Do I keep you awake?" "You don't snore, if that's what you mean." Pamela laughed. "You don't fart. You don't say other women's names in your dreams." "Truly, Louis, why do you think I want a bigger bed?" "So I don't have to have sex with you?" "Don't you think I can fend you off if you come too close to me?" "You're such a dope." "I'll always love you, Louis. I want to give you what you need, but something has changed in me." "It's massive, Louis." "I wish this hadn't happened, but it has." It didn't occur to me to try to process what Pam signaled by her use of the adjective massive, but then heroin tends to dull anxiety. I simply hovered between smacked-out insouciance and self-obsessed withdrawal. For Pam it must have been like living with a cuddly sheepdog that occasionally wakes up to chase a mosquito. We found a sort of warehouse in Hampshire that sold old French beds, and drove out there to select one that suited us. We agreed on a hugely overbuilt and oversized double bed that had a high walnut headboard and footboard. The headboard was richly grained, and in the rather dim light in the corner of the warehouse where the bed had been positioned, it seemed quite attractive. It was when the deliveryman assembled the bed in our sunny bedroom that I noticed something quite strange. The wood grain on one side of the headboard seemed to be more richly incised than on the other. It was as though one side had been persistently polished by some obsessive soul throughout the 150 years of its life in a grand farmhouse somewhere in France. "You know what those marks are, Pam?" I pointed out. "The darker grain is because someone's head has rested there, night after night, greasy hair like wax bringing out the images suggested by the natural whirls in the timber." "Yes, and those smudges are from a man's head," said Pamela, grimacing with distaste. "That's the man's side of the bed." "My side." I managed to laugh, but I felt degraded by the exchange. And it didn't feel fair. I hadn't stained the damned headboard. I didn't wear any kind of gel in my hair. My side. Smudges. Greasy hair, on my side. I was an addict before I met Pam. When she eventually realized I was using the drug regularly, I think she really thought she could change me. In part, her failure to get me clean made my addiction worse. Shame was ladled onto discomfort when I tried to withdraw. And Pam was impatient. She was such a potent woman, so powerful and dominant. Was she a mother figure to me? No. I worshipped her like a goddess, and I think that infuriated her. She wanted passionate and hearty sex, companionship, and excitement. At first I think I intrigued her, and, stoned as I often was, our languorous and lengthy sex sessions suited her. Then suddenly everything that was good about our marriage was slipping away. I had become a self-obsessed bore. Perhaps I'm being hard on myself. She had her part to play, but listening to me revel in my drug-induced hallucinations must have been infuriating. At that moment, in the welling delirium of withdrawal and the feeling of Pamela's absolute disdain for me, and possibly at that moment for all greasy men, the whirls and shapes in the grain took on a psychedelic nature, and a dozen screaming ghost-like faces appeared, like those created by my father's namesake Edvard Munch. Somehow this image penetrated so deeply into my vulnerable psyche that for several months I became completely obsessed with figuring out who had once leaned his head in that spot on the bed night after night, and what had been in his mind. What nightmares, what visions, what horrors. I remember An, poor kid, trying to console me over and over again, promising she would help me somehow. By the time I recovered, a week later, Pamela was gone, never to return, never to make any claim on me, never to make any claim on Rain. Pamela simply disappeared. I had no way of tracking her down. Of course my drug use got worse for a while. The hallucinations evolved into full-blown conversations with erotic nymph-like angels and diabolical gargoyles that I could touch and even smell if I wished. I was fearless, and therefore very dangerous to myself and my daughter. Pamela had no idea. I felt sure of that. Walter's parents, Harry and Sally, helped me greatly in that difficult time. They took Rain in for months on end, and let me stay in their guest room so I could be close to her. They were both expert riders, and because Walter had taken against horses as a child for some reason, they jumped at the chance to teach Rain to ride. It took her mind off my particular troubles that were of course really no worse than her own, and she adored their two horses. I often wondered then at how well Rain handled being without a mother. I remember Walter and Rain, barely 12 years old, both sitting in tense rapture as I described some of the peculiar things I was seeing in my head. Rain stopped trying to convince me she could help me back to sanity when she saw that Walter, who she worshipped, thought that what I was talking about was really very cool. Artists maybe see things differently to you and me. I was sitting with them both before a blazing log fire, hot chocolate for them, cognac for me on top of a heroin and cocaine speedball. Or perhaps the difference is that they try to let us share what they see by transforming it into drawings, music, or story. I wish I could be an artist. What I often see and hear when I'm not feeling all that great is as interesting and enthralling as what I feel when I'm joyful and happy. I wished I could tell them about the nymphs and gargoyles. When we feel pain, we know we are human, that we are alive. For me, physical pain is not always something to be numbed. but what I do need to dampen down is what goes on in my head. I need to be able to see and hear it clearly, to have some distance, to be able to express it. The kids wanted to know exactly what it was I could hear and see. I didn't want to frighten them, but I wanted to explain myself, why I was the way I was. You're old enough to know about drugs. I bet the older kids at school are experimenting. But the chemicals in our own bodies and brain are far more powerful. If I stop for a moment and look intensely at something like the flames and smoke in the fire, then my mind can go either way. Like now I see nude women dancing. Nothing naughty. It's like a ballet. But now they turn into writhing golden snakes. Now the smoke looks like heavy fabric, and the embers hide a glowing animal beneath, something like a whale, on fire. What an artist can do is take such images and turn them into something tangible. When one of my clients, the painters or sculptors that I represent, shows me their work, they know I appreciate that there isn't always a clear logic behind what they do. They might simply be trying to tap into what normal people might call madness. Harry and Sally Watts were part of the same set as Pam and me. We were arty-farty types who tolerated each other's eccentricities and self-indulgences, and could often be overheard saying to one another things like, "Your work ethic is what makes you who you are," or "If you hadn't been a junkie you wouldn't be able to appreciate the kind of artists you work with." We were all overly liberal, and I think Harry and Sally thought my addiction was a kind of badge of honor. But we all made money, enough to live a decent and comfortable life. Harry and Sally lived with Walter on a pleasant road that ran along the quiet side of Ealing Common. Unusually, their large Edwardian house had never been divided into flats, and they enjoyed a huge rambling garden as well as the 3 guest bedrooms on the second floor that had rarely been used until my arrival with Rain. We were never made to feel we were in the way. I'm not a bad cook, so I was able to contribute to the running of the house, shopping, and making many evening meals. Harry was often working in the evening, performing at concerts, sometimes away for days at a time. Sally seemed to genuinely enjoy my company, rather than merely tolerate it. She was a very successful painter of modern equestrian scenes, and of racing events and famous meetings like the Grand National. The fact that I dealt in art gave us some common ground. Harry and Sally kept their horses at a large establishment in Highfield, a greenbelt village in Middlesex, about 35 minutes' drive from Ealing. Highfield's compact main street boasted a few antique shops and a post office, and the village was surrounded by fairly flat woodland and fields perfect for hacking and jumping. Rain quickly became an eager horsewoman, despite Walter's reluctance to get involved. Harry and Sally were regarded as experts, and although they didn't compete, they were keen on attending all the gymkhanas and dressage events in the area. Without the passion for horses and riding, that fire, that explosive exhaustion that his mother in particular felt after a gallop, Walter would never have been born. She told me that it was only after a gallop that she and Harry could make love. In this upper-middle-class world, caught between town and country, art, music, and the meadow, Harry and Sally managed to make this a relatively happy time for Rain and me. One distinction in parenting protocol that arose awkwardly in our time at the Watts household was that Walter and I seemed rather to follow our noses in our chosen pursuits, while Harry, Sally, and Rain believed that intense and long practice sessions were what led to success. I understood perfectly that without her old-school training in fine art, Sally would never have become the excellent draftswoman she was. She had churned out nearly 500 paintings and drawings before she made her first profitable sale at the age of 31. Her style was refined and perfected by that time, and yet still evolving. She had never stopped training. She sketched constantly, taking advice and lessons from other painters and analyzing the work of the great equestrian painters who had gone before or were her contemporary competitors. For his part, Harry practiced incessantly on his large home organ. It was an old-fashioned console with 3 keyboard manuals, 2 ranks of stops, and a full pedal board, but it was entirely electronic, and he often practiced late into the night wearing earphones. It was as if he became part of the machine. He could play almost any organ music placed before him. His sight reading was unconscious and perfect, and yet his performances were highly regarded for his ability to bring emotion and new life to the well-known organ classics. Rain, riding as often as she could, jumping like a champion, wanted to be a writer. She read constantly, but also wrote stories and poems, and was soon contributing almost 50% of the content of the magazine published monthly by the Highfield Equestrian Centre Harry and Sally used. I ran against the grain. The paintings I preferred were mainly by untrained artists. The music I liked best tended to be by the renegades of serious music. So I introduced Walter to a lot of wild jazz and primitive folk music, as well as some of the less conventional orchestral composers of the period. Walter seemed to lean this way too. He learned harmonica, piano, and guitar without lessons of any kind. His practice was self-indulgent. He played what he wanted to hear, or he tried to play what would most delight him. So he was constantly aspiring to do better, but never thought to have lessons. Harry couldn't really help Walter musically. His own world was too traditional and conservative. Sally often complimented Walter if she heard him play something she liked, but she too had taken the academic road and wished that Walter would work with a real music teacher rather than hang out with me listening to my old vinyl albums of Fats Waller, Louis Armstrong, Sun Ra, John Fay, Bert Jansch, Davy Graham, Archie Shepp, and Stockhausen. We were all surprised, pleasantly, when Walter suddenly took an interest in the neglected garden at the house in Ealing and began to work it, almost intuitively as well as skillfully, into a semblance of order and dignity. It seemed natural then that he should be attracted to nearby Kew Gardens, and to the lectures and tours there. And after his GCSE exams he enrolled as a student at the Royal Agricultural University near Cirencester. Harry's sister and Walter's favourite aunt, Harriet, lived in nearby Tetbury, so the location was perfect. Walter studied for 2 years, and passed his finals with honours. Then, to Harry and Sally's chagrin, he joined Crow Williams's band. Crow was already doing very well at Dingwalls at the time, but he accepted that Walter's charisma and talent would be a boost. Crow also wanted not to be a front man, and it was he who christened the reoriented band Walter and his famous stand. For a time while sharing the Watts' home, I became increasingly unhinged. Stopping using heroin isn't the hardest thing, at least not for me. It's dealing with the creative itch that is tricky. As I say, I had explained to the kids the extraordinary things I could see. But now this became an uninvited part of my everyday life. I wanted to be clean, to live with who God made me, as it were. So one day, I can't really remember exactly when, I committed to getting straight, and it was then that I realized why so many addicts don't manage to stay clean. It isn't the misery of withdrawal that propels you to pick up again, it's the enormous magnitude of what it feels like to be merely a normal human being, passing through a regular day. The bedhead visions that had so irritated Pamela began to flood into everything that I looked at intently. I started to see, in every piece of wood grain, what I took to be the faces of various incarnations of gods, messiahs, and other divine messengers. This didn't feel like madness to me. It felt like revelation. I felt as though I were being given clues, signals, and signs that I was on the right track, that I was in contact with a spiritual mechanism that would free my soul. These found images were the basis of a new code for me. I was becoming increasingly obsessive as the months passed. Then I diversified, seeing the very same kind of beatific or screaming faces in the pattern on the linoleum on the floor of my GP's waiting room, in the clouds in the sky, in smoke rising from a fire, or in the ripples in running water. I would like to try to explain what transpired, how I found my way back to sanity, but it is really, truly, another story. In a way, Walter and Rain, even as the little kids they both were, really did help me. As I say, they listened. I worried that I might have frightened them, planted terrible seeds of fear about what might happen to the human mind given enough stress, trauma, and ginger-fucking-headed nympho disloyalty. In my case, after several years I relapsed, as addicts call their return to drugs. Even now, as I write about those times, my anger returns. Those kids helped me. My own story is tightly interwoven with Walter's. Let's just say that after a while, I got well. By the summer of 1995 I was clean. As a result of what I had seen and suffered, I began to look for the aberrations in art, the distortions, and the nightmares. What I had experienced, and the visions I'd had, would have enriched my life had I been a painter like Munch, or Van Gogh, or Dali. But I am not an artist, and yet I had seen ghosts, and then found a new language in every aspect of nature, which spoke to me of good and evil and all the shades in between. Best of all, soon after, I discovered the outsiders, the artistes bruts, and in the end I felt that it was probably all predestined. Chapter 3. In the summer of 1996 the time came when I had to speak to Andre Tilda copyright-ish formally about our business affairs. He, the artist, me, his dealer. Maud brought him to my apartment, and it quickly became clear that despite her great love for Nick he was starting to irritate and annoy her terribly. He was fidgety and uneasy, but smiling all the time, in a dreamy, unengaged way. He had begun to look so much older than Maud. His long curly hair that she had once described as golden now looked dirty. His skin was wizened by the sun. He was still handsome, but looked smaller than I imagined he would be. But that is often how the pop stars of our youth appear when we confront them for the first time face to face. They are often smaller or taller, uglier or better looking. Photographs, movies, and television all deceive in different ways. I'd never seen him perform, but knew his records. He was growing old, shrinking into himself. He seemed to be at the absolute center of his own world. "You like my paintings?" He picked up one of his own charcoal drawings that was now beautifully framed, already sold to a collector who happened also to be a retired rock star, one of Nick's peers in fact. "Very much, Nikolai," I said. "What you saw up in the lakes was extraordinary, but even if you had simply drawn things you imagined, your work would be stunning." "I saw it all right," he barked, but not aggressively. Rather he almost shouted gleefully. "A huge angel that filled the sky." "Yes, dear," soothed Maud. "There is no question about what you saw. My godson Walter would send his respects." "I know." I wanted to distract them both. "He has all your albums." Our first album sold 45,000 copies in the first 6 months, but in 10 years it had sold close to 1,977,649 copies. Amazing that you can remember. Our second was much more successful. We sold 2,700,000. Maud interrupted him. "Please, Nikolai, a broken bar." "You can't stop me now," he shouted. His head was high in the air, rocking from side to side. Indeed, she could not stop him, and he listed the precise sales of every one of the 12 albums his band released prior to his appearance in John Boyd's film. It took nearly 10 minutes. "Last," he said, coming to the end, "was the album we called Here Ground Zero, which contained the song A Here Ground Zero that was written for John Boyd's film, in which I appeared as Nikolai Andre Tilda copyright-ish. That sold quite poorly because I had left the band before the filming and we didn't tour. Just 852,000 copies. It's the only one I don't have precise figures for." "Precise enough," I laughed. "No," he turned on me, very serious. "Not precise enough at all. I wish I had exact figures." "The film changed things for you," I said, a simple statement of fact that seemed to divert him and bring him back into the present. "I saw these wonderful things," he said, smiling happily, "and I was able to draw them. Now I paint them. You sell them. Maud gets money. This is all very good indeed. I am very happy about it." "Good," I agreed, watching Maud, who appeared to be terribly uneasy, perhaps embarrassed at what a simpleton her husband had seemed. Nick noticed Maud's anxiety and startled both of us when he spoke again. "Louis likes you, Maud," he said. "I can see that. I'm not jealous." This unsettled me. How did he know I was so attracted to Maud? I supposed he had an eye for it, or sixth sense. He turned to his wife. "I neglected you, Maud, when the band was on the road all the time. But darling, I never cheated on you. All the other rock guys were cheating, but I loved you so much. We should have had children, Maud. But how could we have a family when I was away all the time? Life is better now. Don't you think, Maud? Don't you agree that life is better for us now? Maud nodded, looking shyly at me. It was clear that Nick was a good-hearted man, a sweet, kind man. What he had seen, and his representations in charcoal and paint, obviously delighted him. He felt special. He felt chosen. He was proud of himself. Life is good, Nick, she agreed. Better now, yes. But I sometimes wondered if Nick's dependence on her was hard for her to accept. Now she looked at me awkwardly, as if to say, I will never have any peace now. It occurred to me while we were talking that Nick might be able to give Walter some advice. Despite Maud's discomfort, I decided to take a chance. Walter was frightened, troubled, and on the edge of depression. Nick, by contrast, was happy. Maud, Nick, can I prevail on you for some advice? They both nodded. I told you about my godson Walter, I continued. He has been experiencing some strange things himself. Not visions, but sounds, like music, and it is rarely pleasant. You think Nick could help? Maud looked quizzical. You know, yes, I do think he might be able to help, I confessed. Nick seems to bear what happened to him, the massive breakdown he suffered, with such equanimity, and he has steered it to such a wonderful outcome with his art. Nick was a working musician once, just like your godson. She was ready to agree. I can't see any harm in trying. I described what Walter had been experiencing. Without embellishment, my godson was hearing daunting sounds that he believed might be emanating from the people in his audience. Nick and Maud listened carefully. Then Nick seemed to make a decision. There is no question, he interjected firmly. I can help your godson. I know exactly how to help. After they left, I considered whether I should call Walter, and when. I hadn't spoken to him for some time. His manager Frank Lovelace was, as I say, an extremely hard-driving and high-achieving man, and I'd heard that Walter was becoming uneasy about where his band was headed under Lovelace's guidance. Lovelace was good-looking in a slightly battered, East London way with a good head of dark hair. He was my height, about 5'9", and carried himself lightly, in a manner that suggested he would be fast-moving in a fight. He was always suited up, in a kind of shiny mohair that looked cheap but was actually very expensive. He was not always without a tie, but he preferred expensive dark shirts in equally expensive-looking material, often with gold or silver thread at the seams, the two top buttons left open. His hands were calloused because he spent a fair bit of time boxing for a hobby, as his slightly battered nose betrayed. His eyes were a vivid blue, his teeth rather wolverine, but they were shiny white. Even so, his breath wasn't always good. One felt challenged not to grimace and look away when he came close in order to say something intimate or secret. To make deals in the music business, it was not unusual for managers to be tough guys, and to intimidate the record company people into favoring the artists they represented, but also to bully the artists in order to make good on careless promises they had made to record companies or show promoters. He'll do what I fucking say, Lovelace would tell the business people he dealt with, the show promoters and record company bosses. Just give us the advance we need and leave him to me. If there were any qualifications or reservations, he might sink into personal attacks. Listen, he would hiss, his face inches from his adversary. You fucking little twat. I was in this business when you were at school lusting over Debbie Harry. Despite my conviction that he was potentially an artist destined for more than Dingwalls, and that Lovelace's efforts could almost certainly make him richer, Walter seemed to be entirely comfortable in the old dive, and in other modest venues like it. He appeared to love the smoky pubs and clubs packed to the roof with fans who could reach out and touch him, punch him, or even spit at him in the fourth wave manner if they wished. The band was selling a lot of albums and CDs, and he and Siobhan had a good little flat in South Ealing. She had also inherited her father's cottage in Duncannon close to the sea near Waterford in Ireland. They retreated there sometimes when Walter wanted to write new songs. Walter's band lineup was simple: singer with a harmonica, guitar, bass, drums. I'd often been to see them at Dingwall's rehearsals and live performances. I'd station myself at the bar at the back. On guitar was Crow Williams. Crow was a purist. He played a Fender Telecaster with heavy strings through a small, but loud, vintage Fender Deluxe amplifier. For fuck's sake, he would shout in rehearsal, "I can't fucking hear myself, and when I can hear, we sound like a bad imitation of the fucking Shadows." His Telecaster would bounce off the wooden floor and there would be another scar on its pale cream body. The band members just looked on, impassive. Crow never hit anyone, but he was scary. He used no effects, no pedals, no echo, no compression. He got his name from his black hair that he wore long like Ronnie Wood of the Stones, or it could have been from his grim expression and slightly hooked nose. He was striking looking, and attractive to women. His blonde wife, Agneta, was a stunning and voluptuous Swedish businesswoman who looked like a glamour model. Crow had met Walter in their college days. He had been at a nearby college studying art, while Rain was at the same place studying journalism, so he knew her pretty well. Rain told me that Crow was really the leader of the band, even though he never wrote songs and never spoke about the band in public. In group interviews with the press he would never utter a single word, and rarely even nod to support what the other band members said. But he was the one who decided what they would play, how they would play it, and even how long they would perform. He was against on-stage showing off of any kind, except by Walter, who was permitted a few flashy moments simply because he was the frontman. Crow never seemed jealous of Walter's status or reputation. Whenever creative matters came up for discussion, for example prior to recording sessions, he would simply pull out the same 6 vinyl albums. "Let me remind you lot what our mantra is here, what it is we do." Then he would yank his shabby army surplus bag open and lift out several old vinyl albums. "This is the pinnacle. This is the White Cliffs of Dover we jump from. This is where we start. We are a pub rock band, we do not play fucking jazz." The albums were Booker T and the MG's greatest hits, Jimmy Reed at Carnegie Hall, the Everly Brothers' greatest hits, 2 albums, a white label collection of Johnny Kidd and the Pirates singles, the best of Little Walter on Chess Records, and Bob Dylan's Nashville Skyline. Crow wanted to control where they were supposed to be heading with their music, not merely to exert influence. Somehow, after sitting for several hours in moody silence while Crow made the band members, and anyone else who was creatively involved, listen to each album or set in turn, the band would knuckle down. As soon as they began to play, one got the impression of a large old American car with a V8 engine always spitting nearly a quarter of a gallon of wasted gasoline from its exhaust pipes onto the asphalt before it finally got rolling ruthlessly toward you, blowing out blue smoke. On bass guitar was Steve Hansen. Hansen, as he liked to be called, was the exception to the pub rock rule in Walter and his stand. "We get it, Crow," he would say. "No jazz." He would rub the side of his nose slowly and deliberately, aping Walter's quirk, both teasing him and getting a conspiratorial smile from him in return. Crow was too serious. That was their message to each other. Hansen was tall and very heavily built and possibly even a little overweight, but he was regarded by everyone as a gentle giant. The truth is he could have been a fighter if he'd wished, but was too laid back to bother. His grey blonde hair was long and slightly thin on top, often pulled back in a ponytail. He usually wore light-coloured clothes, safari jackets, and sometimes even those Australian hats that seemed too big and should come with corks hanging down, like Crocodile Dundee. In winter he always wore a raincoat that nearly touched the ground. He didn't care if he looked unfashionable. If he had not been on bass, more of his extraordinary musicianship might have been manifested. Indeed, it was a measure of his musicianship that he was both able and content to serve as bass player, and to do so without any ostentation whatsoever. He never played an unnecessary or superfluous note. And yet he was a gifted pianist and classical organist, and when Crow allowed, Hansen would move to the Hammond organ, always played straight, without the whirling Leslie speaker sound so loved by most rock keyboardists, and covered the simple bass patterns required for Walter's music with his feet and the organ pedals. When you play a Hammond solo, can you just play the fucking notes and not twiddle that underwater thingy? Crow would command and grin menacingly, but Hanson understood. No whirling Leslie speaker. Keep your effing wig on. Hanson held his own with Crow, never raising his voice. I get it. We need to be more green onions, more early Booker T than Billy Preston. But fuck it, Crow, both those guys are geniuses. But you're not, Crow would retort. Keep your grade 7 shit out of this band. Hanson often quietly took Walter aside and made him sit and listen to the experimental orchestral recordings of G8 tilde Pill Crow G Ligeti and the advanced and anarchic piano jazz of Bud Powell. The intention was never to try to broaden what they did in the band, nor to challenge it, merely to acknowledge that crazy music was out there, and that what they were doing was providing a kind of deeply rooted backbone, a link to the very guts of popular radio music most appropriate to listen to while driving down a long straight road. On drums was Hanson's wife, Patty. Patty was like her husband-A musical dark horse. She too had studied at the Royal Academy, and could play viola, most of the instruments in the Baroque viol family, and she could do okay on cello. She could play double bass too if the band ever wanted to take their music down a tone and evoke the early Nashville Hank Williams trio sound that Crow occasionally permitted. Patty also had an extraordinary and versatile voice that was mostly wasted in the band. She could read music, of course, and could sing opera if she wished. She could also emulate and imitate almost any female singer under the sun. She did wonderful, funny impressions of Dolly Parton, Tammy Wynette, Nina Simone, and even singers with quite unique voices like Ella Fitzgerald. What made her so great as a pub rock drummer was that it sometimes seemed she could barely play, despite her extraordinary body, statuesque and curvaceous, but also graceful and strong, a body that had already passed into legend among her fans. She didn't appear to have the strength or coordination to be a powerful rock drummer, and so she played very little, but very well, and very tightly. This was precisely what made the sound of the band so distinctive. Because they were so tight they seemed louder than in fact they were. It might be useful here to speak about Walter strictly with respect to his work and role in the band. As a musician, Walter was disciplined and devoted. He felt supremely lucky to do what he did, and not to have to follow the career path laid out for him after college, slaving in some commercial garden centre come blue rinse ladies' day out like Quisley, pruning roses all day. His songwriting was always impulsive. He rarely thought deeply about what he would put down on paper and usually left the music to Crow to polish off. Walter could play both the guitar and the piano pretty well, and did so on the demo recordings he made in his little home studio. But unlike Crow, he was not averse to experimenting with effects boxes on his harmonicas to create new rhythms and complex and interesting sounds. Walter's wife Siobhan, like me, had great ambitions for him, but of a different nature. As Walter had told me that night when he suddenly turned up at my flat, she felt he could be a poet. In my view, had he not chosen Dingwalls as his primary performance venue, Walter might have made a half-decent poet. The fact is, few people know what a poet really is, or what a good poem should be, whether it should be spoken or sung, or rapped out in street slang. Walter had a fairly good way with words. It was his immense good fortune that Crow had absolutely no interest in taking any credit for helping Walter to complete his very basic home demo recordings. The fact that Crow helped Walter tighten up his songs but wanted no share in the writing royalties meant that neither of the other two members felt they could demand a share. Walter didn't think about this very much. He made about 3 times as much money as the rest of the band members, but they sold plenty of CDs, the proceeds of which they all shared, and they all lived well enough. It must be said that, although Crow felt sure neither he nor Walter would ever leave pub rock behind, Steve and Patty Hanson wanted to be famous and rich. This was not about amassing money. It was because they knew that sooner or later they would begin to feel trapped by the sheer simplicity of what they played in the band. Being rich would allow them to diversify, and maybe to do so in a medium less commercially safe than pub rock. They saw Big Walter and his stand and their residency at Dingwalls as a stepping stone. Walter and Crow were both aware of the Hansons' ambitions, But it was also very clear that Crow for one had no conception of what they might have in mind. Crow had deliberately confined and limited his musical language in order to give it nozzle power. He might have understood that the Hansons might want to write symphonies, but he would have had great difficulty allowing the idea to stay in his mind long enough for him to start worrying about it as a reality. It would be like someone sitting down to enjoy a meal consisting of a perfect steak, salad, and fries longing instead for foie gras and mixed olives. It simply wasn't conceivable. It was not in his vocabulary. The Stand wasn't exactly a straitjacket for Walter. There were subtle differences in the band and musical influences beyond the basic pop rock, but I knew none of them could help him with the strange sounds he was hearing. He too seemed to sense that the politics in the band were set in stone. Whoever he turned to, he would upset or distract the others. Crow might understand, might even be sympathetic to Walter's dilemma, but he would want him to man up. The Hansons would start prattling on about Stockhausen and the mysticism of sound, and Crow would flip. Crow was the boss. He represented the end stop to all and any musical diversions. Many months later, after some time worrying and fretting about how I might help my godson, a new possibility had presented itself. I phoned Walter on a warm, sunny morning in August. Walter. I met with Paul Jackson, Nikolai and Ratilda. Copyright Vision now, of course. I'm selling his paintings for him. Aha, terrific, breathed Walter. How did that come about? I explained about the visit from Maud and Ratilda, Copyright Vish's wife. Walter had loved the curious life of Nikolai and Ratilda, Copyright Vish, returning to the cinema to see it over a dozen times when he was between the ages of 8 and 13. It had become something of a cult classic, shown regularly at the Electric Cinema on Portobello Road. He's a painter now. Extraordinary drawings and paintings made while he was living rough up in the lakes. Does he still make music? I think he experienced really enormous trauma of some kind while he was working on the film. He just produces art now. I say that, although he hasn't done anything new since he returned to his wife, but I'm hopeful. I'm just organizing the first exhibition of the works he did while he was up the mountain. There are lots of them, and they're all good. So how is he? Is he okay? Said Walter. He is very clear about what happened. He speaks of a revelation. Not mad. Then, not mad, I confirmed. Neither are you mad, Walter. I'm hearing some really strange stuff. You know that. A psychiatrist might regard me as mad. A little bit. You told me about the A sound attacks. Isn't that what you called them? Yeah, he slurred. And I've been getting more of them, and there's something new. I am starting to see lights now too, and they usually combine to form a single very bright light. You know I don't do drugs. That sounds like Nick's final moments in the movie, I said. His revelation began that way, with the intense light from the lamps used to backlight him. Is it like that? Not quite, said Walter. I do see a light, almost like a star in the sky, but it's explosive. Inside that starburst is a child.